I am Yamato Cannon, and this is Muffin, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Talk to Thorin. My guest for this one is going to be Inero, who is the head coach of Golden Guardians, which actually has been for quite a while, but then there was a bizarre period a couple of years ago where briefly he demoted himself to the academy and then brought himself back up, which is, don't know, some sort of who knows why that happened. Won't really address it in this interview, quite frankly, but just a piece of trivia for people there. Right, so obviously, I would say there's a few major things people are interested in about Golden Guardians at the moment. One is basically the team you don't have, which is most of the players that went over to 100 Thieves. People are probably interested to know maybe some thoughts about them. Secondly, there's obviously the current team, which has a lot of newer faces people haven't seen before. And then the third angle is just classic drama cycle, which is where people implied that the team isn't doing well. Well, what the reasons would those be? If you're not going to blame the players, you have to blame the coaching staff. And it was, Inero's been there ages, and did he just hire basically all the staff because they're his friends, etc. So you know what? Yeah. I know how these things work, mate. A real interview, we'd make that second one, that'd just be a thing by the by. Let's just start with actually, we'll get out of the way, then we can just talk about real League of Legends and actual things, that aren't just people's opinions. So starting in that place, right? When did you first hear this sentiment that essentially, by the way, this is the problem, right? What I found very weird about it was, I noticed a few people have sort of said this or agreed with it, especially people on Reddit, because obviously they kind of flame Golden Guardians, they don't think it's a great org. But what I'm a bit confused by is, on its face, on the absolute surface, it only works actually as a diss if you've hired your friends and they're incompetent coaches. That's where it becomes a problem. I found it actually weird that people were implying but it's friends with all those people. I don't know if you guys know this, but if I would become a coach tomorrow, you think I wouldn't hire all my friends who I think are sick analysts, LS, fucking all? Of course I would. That'd be the first thing I'd do. So give us some thoughts on this. Where did you first hear this sentiment? How true is it? Have you been friends? Have you had a past relationship with the main people you brought in as your coaches?
Yeah, so I've heard this sentiment before, not even on this team. Just why I've joked about it multiple times in the past on Twitter of, Nero's hiring his friends again, there he goes. So I heard it again this time just on the show. I was just listening in because someone tagged me in it.
This is on Face Check, right?
Yeah, and the Face Check one, I was like, here we go again. Nero hires his friends, and the rest of it, we're getting flamed for being bad, which is fair. That's going to happen when you're a last place team. You're going to get fucking railed by everyone. But that one, I was just man, that I always hated hearing it because it's just disrespecting my coworkers. They got their job because I thought they were good, and I don't want people to think, they're just my friend. And that's how they got it. But we interviewed them alongside a lot of people, and for me, all I did, was I recommended them. They were part of a good group of people, a very large list of guys that I recommended to get interviewed, and they came out on top after everything that happened.
So you didn't have the final say
2020 as well. No, I'm just the coach at the end of the day. I'm not the person who actually gets to make the say. Obviously, I'll have a big part in it. If I think a guy's not going to work for the staff, then he's probably not going to get hired. But yeah, that's about where it stands. These guys were with us in 2020. Our only new hire this year was Swiper, because I wanted someone to work in top lane, so we interviewed a couple of guys around that.
Okay, right. On that list, that's obviously relevant in itself, because another thing is, if everyone knows, Swiper is a legendary player from the Oceanic region, and this was another component in it. I saw this is what Dom said, that because you'd coached in the Oceanic region when you were with Order, now all of a sudden, obviously these coaches are from that region, your assistant coaches, etc. Is that relevant to this at all? I do notice, by the way, there is a weird side trend now, where even though on the one hand, it's supposed to be a positive that we can bring in minor region players, particularly obviously Oceanic region at this point in time, and people suspect maybe other regions next year. That's supposed to be a positive, but I noticed those players, they all get flamed to fuck, basically. I think it's about two of them don't. So is that relevant to this aspect at all? Because I think that's what also is making people feel like you're only hiring your friends, the fact that these coaches all come from that region instead of NA.
Yeah, I actually talked to Dom about this just because I wanted to know where it crossed the line when I made my post about it. And I can get where he's coming from, because it's they're all from OS, and I was in OS for a bit. But I told him in that Twitter thread too, I actually didn't have any sort of relationship with these guys outside of Choo-Choo's, who we hired in 2020, was one of the assistant coaches. I had no relationship with them really at all. I knew who they were, obviously, because if you go to Australia, those were the big guys from the region, but otherwise, there's no real interaction with them outside of just the interview. And those guys were also interviewing for different positions while they were here too. I found out Swiper was looking to move into coaching because I heard he was interviewing at TSM. So I reached out to talk to him through that.
Just since we're on the topic,
friend connection.
I know, people will present this as like it's a new innovation, but I actually know if you go back, it's just that a lot of teams in the past who had positional coaches, they just didn't make a big deal out of it. It was often like a behind the scenes thing. Like, I mean, for example, if people have ever seen someone of how I've had a my content before, Malaclips, I think it was like top lane coach. So he was positional coach for some team years ago in Europe. I think it was like Splice. Yeah. So these coaches have existed for a while. And I will say, to me, it's a little bit interesting because while I know a lot of fans dismiss it because they think to themselves that's the one area a coach isn't supposed to be involved. Like, don't tell the pro player how to play the game in that sense. To me, it's actually an area where I am quite interested because, first of all, it exists in all American sports. Like, they have like the quarterbacks coach and the fucking defensive coach and the special teams. They have coaching quite sort of compartmentalized. And also, to me, it's an area where actually I think the West has a chance to maybe take a bit of a lead on Asia in this regard because, as far as I know, in Asia they don't typically have that aspect. They just have their kind of more strict coaching structure, and then they just do everything. And I've heard they have maybe like external analysts or something. So, is this like an important part of the structure going forwards? Is the idea eventually one day down the line to have a coach for every single position that's separate and somehow coordinates this?
Yeah, that was the goal completely. I think it's really important to have just someone, especially who has like professional experience, like someone who's been in that player's shoes before, and understands how the game works and can like maintain still that like relatively high level of play to where they can kind of contest and help, practice those small fundamental like laning things with you. And they understand your role like more in depth than someone who's just focusing on like team review could. Because if I'm going into like a team review, I can't hit on everyone's individual job like the entire time, like the whole game, But that was a big part of us. Like I wanted someone in top jungle mid, and then I can focus a lot of my time towards bot lane, and that's how we ended up with the staff that we had. Like Spooks handles jungle, Choo Choo's handles mid, and Swiper handles top lane. I think it's pretty important. I know like C9 has similar things too. They have Max Waldo working with top, and Vagar V2 I think is helping with their mid lane. I'm not sure like their full specifics. I'm sure Mithy's helping out with support, but having like former pros or people with high elo experience is pretty important. I think a lot of people are shifting towards doing that.
Yeah, the one area where I find it weird that other teams haven't sort of like seen the obvious efficacy of bringing this approach in is I always, at the moment, one of the themes I try to hit on in my talk shows, so no one else seems to bring it up, is that in League of Legends, because the game with the way the meta and form being so fleeting can be so like high turnover, like somebody who's like the 9th best player could be the 2nd best player, and next split, if the right things change around. I feel like the area everyone's really missing is like there is still experience that carries over, even if it's not for this specific champion or you're not at your peak right now. So to me, a lot of people right now are willing to gamble on like the young hot prospect, but the one thing that guy doesn't have is experience of what to do when things change. So to me, it's an obvious area you can sort of bridge that gap without having to just keep the old school play. I know they sort of tried to do this when they had like some of the teams would have it like the player that was in academy, if he was the veteran, then it was the player that was in LCS was the rookie, and you would try and hope that they sort of like worked with each other. But I think if we've had a look at that, like it's a rare sort of player who's a veteran who wants to sort of train his replacement. I think that was a bit of a flawed concept.
Yeah, you don't really help the other side too much.
Exactly.
It's kind of against your interest in a way to really do that.
So, okay, what about this then? So let's just start at the top, right? Obviously, I trust you to know what you can say, what you can't, right? People obviously were super hyped with Golden Guardians last year, specifically in the summer split. Like, I know everyone now is going to spin it like, they weren't even that good because in the regular split, the record was just okay, blah, 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 the rest of it. Yeah. But the part that I find bizarre is like, you almost swept TSM twice, and the key word there is twice because everyone's forgetting like that third game was like that was almost done as well. That was almost a 3-0 twice. So to me, like those results can't be a joke. Like you don't just accidentally trip over and almost beat TSM's best of 5 2 times, who obviously went on to win the split eventually, right? Is it safe to say at the end of the year, if it was up to you, you'd want most of those players to be in Golden Guardians for this year? Is that a reasonable sentiment to say?
Oh, yeah, that was the plan. The plan was to roll back with most of the same guys and look to upgrade where we could. Because we heard about, obviously, the import rule changing for OS. So FBI wasn't going to be an import. And we were like, oh, shit, that's a big ticket for us to upgrade this where we want to and push for actual, like, championship win.
And so what would you say then? Is it just the situation that Golden Guardians isn't in a position where they could offer what 100 Thieves did? Did the players specifically want to leave? I heard it was like some sort of package deal anyway. What would you say to that?
Yeah, it was around all the COVID stuff, obviously led to like funding things. I know a similar thing happened to FlyQuest, I'm pretty sure. It's where obviously like want to be able to compensate these guys for doing better, performing better. Those guys obviously are going to want it too. Because they know their value now. They came in on like league minimum, you know?
Sure.
So obviously like, you're a top team now, like you want to get paid. I can respect that. It just wasn't a real way to like manage what they wanted, where they could obviously get on a good team together and build around that with what we wanted. So we just looked to move them to do like kind of best by them. Like it fucking sucked for us, but I knew at least for my side as a coach, the next year probably would have sucked if we just forced them to play for us when they know they could have probably upgraded on another team and gotten like other players they wanted to play around as a core.
Obviously, from the very beginning of Golden Guardians coming into the LCS, they did actually brand themselves quite heavily with the idea of like it's a development team and, you know, we're going to bring forth new talent, blah, blah, blah. Which, listen, I'll be cynical like I always will. That usually means to me I don't want to spend a lot of money. You know, I'd rather like try and sort of min-max, you know. I mean, the irony is people have just destroyed this term completely. But really the idea is I'm going to try and do like the Moneyball approach. You know, I'm going to try and like get the people that others don't think have that much value. But for my team, they're going to do a little bit extra and it'll make it, you know, sort of more than the sum of its parts. So with that said, it does look like every few years the teams basically only added big names that didn't have anywhere else to go, like Froggen, Haunt. So these were people who just at that point in their career, you know, if they want to play and if they want to probably get paid anything decent, it had to be a team like this. Or it's newer names, you know, it's people that are getting a chance. Is there, what would you say beyond, obviously this extends before, you know, this period, as you say, where certain incomes aren't there, investment might not be able to double down if someone has a sports franchise, for example. I understand why they wouldn't have a load of money to spend this year. What would you say to that? Like when you're a coach within the team, is it understood for you that like, yeah, I might lose some of these players each year, or if someone gets too good, they're going to go and I'm going to have to start over again? Is it something that you see as a similar type project? I'm here to basically just work with what I've got and develop talent every year?
No, actually, like we had a pretty clear process of what we wanted to do, at least between like me and the managers in the first year coming in 2019. Like the whole reason the first roster was like the way it was, a bunch of veterans, that was like the reject roster. Everyone just kind of got like booted from their team or didn't have anywhere to go, and wanted to figure out like what veterans would actually be good to build around, and figured the best way to try it was just throw them all on one team at once. Hopefully we can make playoffs with this team, which like we realistically should be able to if we have like Hanser, Froggen, Ole. You should make playoffs with that at a minimum. Two of those guys won in ALCS, you know? We figured like we'll try that, see who we want to build around from that point, and then try to develop some younger players off of that. We stuck with definitely in contracts that first year because, I mean, realistically, like that team in 2018 before he came in, like it was pretty bad, right? Like it was pretty shit. It didn't do too well. So we figured like those guys might do good. Like contracts came off C9, like maybe he'll do better with veteran guys around him, and definitely was still fairly new. And then the next year was like, okay, now we're going to build rookies like into that roster with the veterans that we wanted to keep, and see how that goes. Which ultimately towards the end ended up going okay, but obviously started off pretty bad since we ended up in a spot where we ended up with Keith support because we ran out of options really there, and Hanser was the veteran that we returned with, and it was more so around building off of FBI and closer. But the whole goal was ultimately like the year after that was the year we were supposed to push to win. I know Danon came in when he was joining management that he had like a 3 or 4 year timeline that he was looking at to make the team a competitive team. Competitive being like not just hitting 6th place in playoffs and burning out, but like actually being like a top 4 team and contesting that spot of where TLC9 TSM are sitting. So that was like the actual plan. The plan was never just to sit around and be like a development team over and over. But obviously I don't really know 100% like what actually is true or not about that. That's obviously the pitch I'm going to get, but I trust Danon with that part. Like he's been pretty straightforward with me with a lot of things. So I'd assume that's where it's at. But as a coach, you know, like I don't get full context of what's really going to happen, you know.
How would you evaluate on this season 9 team? How would you evaluate Froggen's play in this year?
The season of 2019?
Yes.
Yeah. I thought Froggen did pretty well, to be honest. In spring, the time where I got to work with him daily, I think it's kind of hard in NA, at least, I believe, to kind of build a team around Froggen. I do think he'd work really well in just a European team, but I know he really wants to be in the US. But I thought he did good. a lot of the weird picks and stuff that he was pushing and playing as a team, I think that was a big part of why we were actually able to win the games that we did. Like, no one really knew what the fuck to do versus like Karthus mid, you know? Like, I think everyone else had a very stable pull of these 3 champions, and he was playing like Karthus, Vel'Koz, Lux, and no one else was touching that stuff. And he did pretty good. The team didn't necessarily like all get along very well with it, and that wasn't necessarily like Froggen's fault, but I know like certain players didn't necessarily get along with him too well. And ultimately, I thought like he did pretty fucking well with it. He was one of the people we were considering building around towards the end of the year. It was kind of between him and Hanser of who we would actually like stick with after the year.
Right, the classic critique of Froggen that everyone always gives is like, oh, does he roam enough, or is he just only trying to CS and go to a team fight? And does he even play the champions that allow you to roam? Like, obviously, if we think of this type of era, I'm having to cast my mind back a bit. It was like Aurelia, Akali, you know, maybe even Aatrox you could maybe like force. And obviously, he wasn't generally playing. I know he played a couple of games of Aurelia, played like some Talon, the odd game, but obviously these aren't classically his champions. What would you say to that? Because that's the thing that people are going to critique. Because if they look at the highest level mid laners, the perception is you also like spread your lead around and you try and gank the other lanes, etc. What would you say to that?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like I see him pretty similar to PoE. Like he's not really big on those pool of champions. Like you're never going to go in and expect like Froggen's going to play Aurelia this game or something like that, you know? But he still did have like those picks. Like right now in the meta is Lucian. Like he was a huge Lucian player. He loved playing it, and he would do a lot with that pick to try and help the team in jungle and try to advance that lead. And it just wasn't something we ended up like playing on that team at all. But I think he could easily fit off of it. It's just kind of it's kind of hard to find 4 people in NA to fit it, in my opinion. But I don't really stick on too much of the fact that he just kind of sits in his lane and does nothing the whole game. He definitely does try to help his team. He just has a different idea of how to approach to help people out than a lot of people here really play around or are willing to play around.
Since, as you mentioned, obviously he did like innovate some of those picks, or at least he was the only person in NA playing a whole bunch of them, right? When it comes to his champion picks, does he get basically the majority of the say in it? I mean, it does look like he always looks like he's pretty comfortable in the game with whatever he's picked. Is he someone where, like, as a coach, can you sort of like push him in the direction or something? Like, can you ask, can you play this for our comp? How sort of negotiable is it?
I think Froggen's definitely one of the players that got more of the leeway to just kind of pick what he thought was good for the comp. We pretty heavily prioritized him counterpicking, which would go down to those weird picks of like, I don't have experience personally working with players that were playing those picks, so I don't really know what other people are thinking of the matchups until he's kind of told me. But usually would have like a rough idea of like, oh, he kind of expects this pick in this situation is to be something good. And you just kind of confirm that with him and he'll like give it his go ahead of what he thinks is the best thing to pick. But usually you go in and you kind of have a rough idea of what the enemy team's going to pick anyways, and it's already like pre-planned by the time the draft happens.
Obviously, the other name I thought he played particularly well on the team was Haunter. Like, the solo lanes looked like the best aspect of that team. Right, this was the year where, if people don't remember, he'd sort of just been cast out of TSM and seemingly was like one of the players scapegoated for how they'd done with the previous team, you know? I thought it looked like he had a great year in this team. It looked like he really like was one of the all-pro level players for my money. So I know now he's had his issues. He's now back in Academy somehow. I don't know how that's possible, but it just is in LCS. How would you evaluate working with Haunter?
I liked Haunter. I felt like he provided something that's usually a little bit difficult to find in esports, which is that sort of like traditional sports mindset towards improvement and towards team environment. He could be hard-headed. I think everyone who's worked with Haunter kind of echoes on that same type of thing. But I personally liked that he was willing to give his exact opinion on everything. And he would give his opinion to other players on the team too. If someone was just being a prick for the day and just really not approaching with the right mindset in it, it's really important that you don't just have the coaches calling that out, but you have your teammate alongside you saying like, hey man, like that's not cool. You shouldn't be doing this. Like you need to step up and do better. And Haunter was the guy who would do that. So I appreciated working with him a lot. I thought he was really, really helpful to have someone like him on the team, especially when you had younger players like contracts and definitely I thought he was really helpful with that.
Just before we move off this team, the one last player I want to ask about, because to me, listen, contracts and definitely have their own issues at certain points in time, but there also are pretty inexperienced players, and some of them, it was like a brand new lineup for them, etc. But the player I found very underwhelming on this team was Ole, because as you said, he was a champion of the LCS. And in fact, if people go back a few years earlier, he looked like a fucking really sick support player in the LCS. Actually, he had a lot of promise. I mean, people forget that on the Immortals team, people were like having this guy as an MVP candidate. So. What can you actually say? I mean, we're a few years away now. What went wrong there? Because it looked like something like mental went boom or something, right? What happened to this guy?
I think he had just a lot of personal stuff in his life to deal with. He just wasn't in like his happiest place. I'm really good friends with him now after the fact, but I know he was struggling during that time. That's something we've talked about together a lot now too. I know he's in a better space, but during that time, it wasn't too great for him. I know he was trying to come off of like smoking cigarettes at the time, and he ended up doing that one day, actually, funny enough, like right before a game day. And he let us know after, sorry guys, I stopped smoking last night and I felt so bad today in the game. And we're like, what the hell, man? Why of all days did you have to choose this? But like looking back, like I don't really blame him for any of the things that happened, because I know he was struggling with his own personal battles internally. But I know he's in a good spot now. Definitely just wasn't in the best space to be competing. But considering what he was going through, like he was doing pretty well with that.
If we go to last year's team, the player I want to ask about, because it's obviously been the hot topic the last few months, is Damonte. Because the one thing I found very interesting is I can sort of understand why in his early years he got like the golden glue treatment, where you keep coming up, you get your chance, and then people just keep saying like, nah, not now. And then you get kicked back down to academy, but you prove yourself, you come back up, you got a good work ethic, blah, blah, blah. But the thing that seemed to change, and particularly it looked like he really nailed it in your team, he was doing it in clutch as well, is it's almost like he became, and this is why I want to ask from a coaching perspective, it's almost like he must be on some level like very self-aware, or he must like be very reflective on his game, because normally the flaw of a player like that is they still keep thinking they're just going to be like the best player at their position, and then they sink or swim, right? He seems like someone who almost sort of learned how to offset his weaknesses, and I know as a result people, if they want to critique him, just talk about everything he isn't as a mid laner, but he can, if he has his champions and he's in the right team, he can certainly play the game. So what would you say?
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. He's very self-aware. He's straightforward about what he sucks at. And he just tries to attack that and do things differently. If he's really bad at playing like Azir or something in meta, he tries to find a way to at least beat it. I know like when we played TSM, that's why like Ziggs popped up. Like we weren't a big Azir playing team at all, but we had this random Ziggs pick. It's like, cool, this team probably hasn't practiced versus very much, and at least like we'll have practice on that. And he would just work around ways to do that. And then outside of that, like he was a good just, you need like a hype guy on the team sometimes. He was really good at providing that, being that kind of internal voice for the team. He wasn't the leader, like Kevin was more so the leader for our team, or Hanser. But he was the guy that would like hype us up and like try to get everyone like really energized in game, so everyone feels like, all right, cool, this game's won. Like I can do whatever I want. Like this guy's like kind of feeding me that energy, So he was pretty important piece to a team. He's just not necessarily going to be the guy who's like carrying the game for you on like scoreboard or anything, It's all intangible stuff usually.
The irony, if you hear when people critique, like the aforementioned PoE and Froggen, the players who are famous for playing the mages, is the critique about them nearly always goes to they don't play like fucking, like, I don't know, like Akali or like, some ridiculous shit. They don't play basically like leaders champion pool. They don't play all the super aggressive stuff, right? Even though that's a massive critique of those players, I have noticed you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. Because if you go on the other side of the equation and you don't play Orianna and Azir, basically people make out like you just can't have a job as like an LCS or an LEC mid laner. So what would you say to this? Because listen, some of those picks, like, it does just look like the way the game works. One of the two is always going to be viable, if not like one of the best champions in the game for mid lane. It's obviously it's somewhat on the rails, I would say. It's a bit straightforward as to how you play around a champion like that. Do you think actually to be a mid laner at this level, do you have to like be able to at least play the champions, or is it like you said, you have to have the counters to it? How do you explain it? Because it feels like people have made that mentally like a staple that you have to be a top mid laner now.
Yeah, I think if you want to be like a good player, like a good professional player, you need to be able to play both. Like it's just a really important part of it. Otherwise, eventually a meta is going to come around where your picks that you're playing all the time aren't necessarily going to feel that great. The fundamentals should all still carry over, Like it's not like laning changes completely. But you should feel comfortable like playing those champions on those like different matchups. You should understand at least how the matchup works. So if you need to pull it out, you can do it for what your comp needs. I think just being able to only do one isn't something that's really acceptable. I think it's like passable in like regional play. You can obviously get away with it and be fine. But once you go and you're playing against like the best players in the world, you usually will just get exposed and they'll just target your champion pool and kind of hold down the way your team needs to play and counter it.
Right, with the lineup that you had for this year, right, what's bizarre is actually, maybe you have a different perspective than me, but I feel as though you didn't actually get flamed that hard when the roster was initially announced, in part because I actually think the fact that like Immortals, Flycoast, all these teams had like, newer players or players that aren't LCS, I think in some ways people just thought like maybe they were all still buying the bullshit people on Reddit all sell us every offseason. Like, we just want to support people who aren't imports or whatever, and then they just wait until they suck and they go, I hate fucking those players. So we all know like the game that Reddit play, the push and pull there that you can't win either way. Right, with this team though, I have to say I didn't know a lot of these players. Like I obviously didn't know the Niles player at all, so I had no expectations. Plus, I assumed it would be a team that would be near the bottom. Right, when you put this squad together, was this supposed to be some like super scouting job where you really thought like for all these players you've uncovered like some player that no one else knows how good they are? So you clearly didn't have first pick of some of the talent. Like I say, even some of the other good talent went to the other teams. What was the vision when you put this squad together?
We just wanted to give people a shot. Like it's kind of treated almost like an academy roster in a way, and just working in LCS and trying to help these guys develop against the best players as fast as possible and get that experience and stage experience in. Definitely wasn't meant to be like us picking up FBI and closer, like we had really high expectations of those guys immediately being able to compete. But for this, it was definitely just meant to be like building these guys up over the year. Like I came in, everyone like I talked to with the team, I told them like, you should expect that we're not going to be just a team that's really competing for much this year. Like that's not our goal, is to compete and like actually win the LCS. If we do somehow, then like, holy fuck, good job guys. Like that's kind of embarrassing for everyone else, but good job. We're competing for like the next year. We're competing to build you guys up. And I let everyone know that like this spring, I don't want you to have like some sort of weird expectation on yourself from the outside that you need to perform and do like this level of play to prove that you earned your spot. I want you to just go out there and like try to win the game. Try to learn every week and get better and just give like 100%. And if it's not enough, like I'm not going to bench you right now as long as you're getting better. Like I'm going to give you spring and make sure you get that time to just fail on stage. But I'm not expecting you to come out and like prove that you're the next big thing in LCS right now. I just want you to prove that you're like working towards that. So yeah, there's no real expectation of like huge things from the players we were getting immediately.
Right, one angle I noticed people tried to spin to make the like 100 Thieves move, like 4D chess, that, like they're not doing it just for this now, they're doing it for like the end game, is the notion that like, as the rumor goes, maybe at the end of this year, one of Riot's sort of concessions to the owners that are trying to say, just let us import as many as we want, is, okay, you can import as many minor regions. So the idea is just like Oceanic region, maybe Turkey and Brazil, these places maybe join the list that don't count as imports, right? In a world where that happens, the obvious concern to me is like everyone, as far as I can tell, will exploit that. Like at that point in time, like 100 Thieves would have a great team, because at that point in time, only someday in theory would even be an import, and you just keep Closer and FBI, who, let's face it, compared to the native talent, are at least as good, if not better. In fact, most people would say probably the best of the native talent if they become native tomorrow. And all of a sudden, I could see like half the teams in the league being like, assuming he's got Turkish residency, like Broken Blade top, fucking Closer, someone. Essentially, it'll just be all these regions will get brought in. So as far as I can tell, it'll mean probably less NA players or less traditional like LCS non-imports play in the league. Do you have the same suspicion?
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Like people are going to abuse it as much as possible. It makes sense. If you're trying to win, you're going to try and find whatever's the quickest way to do it now. And if that means getting like, a full team built around Closer and FBI who no longer imports, then like, hell yeah, people are going to abuse that. It just kind of makes sense for them too.
Right, obviously you are in a position which is a little bit precarious for this question, but one of the main concerns I know a lot of fans have is this notion that when the owners, I know this was the backlash I saw from a lot of people, when the owners did turn around and say like, we want to have all the import restrictions removed, a lot of people referenced, actually it was something that happened on one of my shows, which is I did a show with Jack and, I can't remember, I think it was Jack and like Carlos and someone else from NA, maybe Steve or something, maybe it was Hotshot, I can't remember. It was a group of owners, right, and it was before franchising came along, and one of the things they said, in fact he might be fucking no know Winston, that's how old it was. When this video happened, one of them, I think it was even Jack, tried to sell the angle that like, no, but if you take away relegation and you let us have a franchise league, then, some of our teams will just develop all the talent. And, we won't need to import that guy to stay in the league because, we'll be able to, come ninth and just develop him and he'll be good in a few years. And obviously the problem is most of the teams haven't really done that at all. If anything, like you've seen, they've just abused the residency thing. And in fact, now they want even more imports in that scenario. So, right, going forwards, do you actually think there is, beyond teams that just don't have the money, is there actually like a real sentiment in NA that people want to develop the native talents?
I think the overall feel is people want to develop the talent, but they don't necessarily want to be the ones to do it. And if they do, they want to be rewarded really heavily with it by like keeping that player in academy, Like, oh, if I'm going to develop the guy in academy, like you better be ready to pay. Like, sure, I may not start him even though he's ready to start, but you better pay a lot for him, to the point where it's like you can't even really give those people a start without spending money that you would spend on like a veteran player. I don't think a lot of the teams actually care too much about developing. From my perspective, like I haven't really gotten the vibe of that. I think for a lot of coaches, it's probably hard for them to justify giving like new players a shot too, when you're very likely to just get fired for doing poorly. But it kind of makes sense that you'll just get fired if that happens, but it makes it hard for you to really commit and know like, yeah, I'm going to take a risk on this guy. I'll risk my nice cushy 6-figure salary on I don't know, this kid that's only played in academy for like 2 years and looks really good. A lot of people aren't going to be willing to do that. It's just like a really high risk. And if the coaches aren't willing to do it, the orgs are probably not going to do it themselves either, unless they just like don't have any money. I haven't felt that way personally. But for me, I think I'm just more on the privileged side of it, of like, I don't care too much if I got fired over making like a risky decision and it didn't work. Thankfully, like my management too, I think are pretty good to me about that, of like allowing me to take those risks. Sure, like Danon might fire me. I don't know. He might just be being nice to me and it could have just worked last time, so I didn't get fired, right? But I think a lot of people don't necessarily have that luxury of feeling secure if they were to lose their job in the LCS, like at the end of the split,
I will give some of the teams credit. Like the first few years of franchising, one of the reasons I did think there was a lot of parity at the mid-table is just like your team in Season 9 or even the Dig team last year where they attempted to do this. There were teams that in theory were supposed to be lower table teams who had players that were like real talents, or like actually some of the good players at one or two positions, which is almost more comparable to like a traditional American sport where, every team has a star player or something, or like almost a Pro Bowl level player in the NFL or whatever. That's actually the way the league's supposed to be designed. This year, though, I do feel as though I can see why some of the like fan backlash happens, because it looks as though people have sort of settled into two camps in LCS. You're either the teams, it's like basically the big 3 or 4, where you're going to break the bank, you're going to bring in the biggest imports you can, and you're going to go to win the LCS, and you're looking at Worlds already. And then there's the other teams that almost look like now they've realised like, well, like 7 teams can't go to Worlds, so what's the point in us like paying Megabucks to maybe come 5th or something, if it doesn't go that well? And so it looks more like they're on the min-max end of the equation, and they're like, let's all just get like a bunch of okay players and either develop them, again, you can make money from that, or just gamble that, it doesn't matter as much if we don't go that high. What do you think of the overall like setup of LCS at the moment? I mean, if the disparity between a roster like Cloud9 or TL and the teams at the bottom is pretty big now.
Yeah, no, it's pretty huge. I think a lot of people have kind of bought into that mentality of it can kind of be like too hard to compete with it. Like you have to just put so much extra funding in to even come close to competing, and even then it's not really guaranteed, because these guys will have like grandfathered imports on their team that are already like national
game breakers, right?
Yeah, it's like, oh, like when TSM had Bjergsen, it's like, oh, he's not an import. Cool, they can get 2 more imports around it. Like, good luck competing with that. Every player already wants to play with Bjergsen anyways, and now they get 2 more imports. Like, of course, they're going to kind of get anyone they want. So I think teams have definitely kind of like just split up. Like, there's definitely a camp of teams that are spending a lot just so they can be like the teams that go to Worlds. And then you can kind of just tell going into offseason whether you're going to be one of those teams or not. And I think a lot of teams will just willingly go into we'll just wait for next year type of thing, hoping they'll have more funding, or maybe they just like hit it on one of their like random import players on the side.
I realise, and I know a lot of fans often get a bit lost on this because they think to themselves that like the residency rules are the same as they were when they were first introduced in like 2016 or whatever it was. But one of the things that makes it confusing now is essentially they've sort of been superseded by the fact that if you just get a green card, like you're legally allowed to work in America at that point in time anyway. It's irrelevant what Riot thinks. Yeah. So really, at this point in time, if people don't know, it's now more about getting a green card. And the real problem there was just that like the last couple of years have meant like it's super hard to get them compared to what it was before. And even if you have them, you can sort of like get them revoked or suspended or whatever. Like there's a million like pitfalls in that scenario, right? So what I would ask is this, just as a general approach, do you think they should just scrap the whole resident thing and it should just be like, leave it up to the government angle? Like if you can get the green card, you can get the green card. If you can't, like forget that thing from the past. Do you think they should get rid of it? Because as you said, by the way, I always was a little bit uncomfortable because kind of what you were alluding to happened. Like what happens basically is if I'm building a roster, I know this particular team isn't like going to win LCS, but EG is an obvious example. It's like if I'm building my roster versus you and we're two GMs, and I'm like, right, so I'll take Impact, not a import, of course. I'll just take him as my top lane. It's like I've already just got like a mad unfair advantage. Like there's only like 2 or 3 players that are like that, and they just have this bizarre status. In fact, the bad thing is the play you talked about before, Bjergsen just removed himself from the pool. They could have had that advantage still in LCS for TSM. So, do you think we should just get rid of the residency thing? Do you see like a purpose in keeping it?
I guess the one thing I could see against getting rid of it would just be the fact that you probably have to have a delay because teams have obviously like planned their whole like roster building around the fact that I have this key player already. Yes. So it'd be like a little unfair to them, like, oh, you changed the rules. But if you could just get rid of it and like there were no problems with that, I would say like probably good to just drop it and allow it if it's a green. Like if they get a green card, like they're gonna do that to be in the US, like cool, let them be a resident and just leave it at that and just get rid of the grandfather thing. I would probably err towards that side, that removing it is just probably the right thing to do to avoid that bias. But you definitely have a big fight over that one for sure. I don't think the owners would be too big of fans, at least not the top 3 owners, the most powerful ones,
Sure.
They'd probably
okay. At the end of this interview, do you have like a final message or something you want to thank us hello to?
One, I just want to thank you for kind of giving me the time to talk about this stuff. I haven't had any interviews at all about this split, and it's nice to just kind of talk about how things are going. Then of course, like thanks to the org. I'm really happy working with Golden Guardians. Obviously got like a little bit of a bad rep at the moment, but they've been definitely the best org I've worked for, and have treated me really well. And I know they've treated the staff here really well, and are trying to do their best by the players too, which I've been happy with. Then thanks to fans that are still supporting us. No, there's not that many. The Golden Guardians Discord is a little slow compared to the others, but there's still a couple of guys hanging out from last split, and hopefully it can help build up this team towards summer. Summer will definitely look different with this team for sure. And if it's not, you guys can crucify me. I deserve it at that point. Like I should probably lose my job if I can't make anything happen by summer. So thanks to the guys supporting, and I'll try and show that this year's worth it for our boys.
This video was kindly supported by Bobby, Lager15, Pronogo, Zachary Carter, Andrew, Alexander Rao, Andreas Kroknes, Animosity, Dean Tanglis, ErikHillestad, Hades, Jdubs, Jensen Goh, Tobias Bernasconi, Zyrathenia, Zoomba, and as always, a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my shows? Do you want to ask a question for my monthly video AMA? Want teasers for who's coming up on my content? Or do you even want to take part in one of those exclusive discussions with me about esports? If so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skilluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.